power and prosperity and freedom. They're wrong, but we haven't awakened to that fact yet. So that's my brief comment. And now I have to give you the talk, which I will do quickly in order to allow time for Stephen to make a response. Now, the title of my talk is U.S. Foreign Policy After Iraq, and the title requires a little bit of explanation. I'm certainly not implying that the Iraq War is now somehow visible in our rearview mirror. On the contrary, I believe that, frankly, regardless of who wins the presidency, the war is going to be with us for years to come, and the consequences of this war are going to be with us for decades to come. But I do believe that what to do about Iraq narrowly is not really the big question confronting the country. Rather, the big question is how are we to deal with the implications of Iraq? That is to say, with the implications of a war of choice that has gone badly wrong. So I'm using the term after in the sense of in light of. U.S. foreign policy in light of all that has occurred since the Iraq War began over 5 years ago. My own judgment is that the developments of the past 5 years have left us strategically adrift. That is, today we have no agreed-upon, principled approach to dealing with the world in which we live. Now, the presidential election campaign ought to provide an opportunity for us to have a great debate about what those principles ought to be. But I fear that the election is shaping up to be a missed opportunity in that regard, in part because the focus remains on what to do about Iraq rather than on examining the larger issues stemming from our failure. Now, let me emphasize that in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, the Bush administration did, in fact, articulate a principled strategy for the global war on terror, a principled strategy that possessed logic and coherence. And this was the strategy of the freedom agenda. It was logical, it was coherent, it was also wildly unrealistic and totally unworkable. That strategy rested on 3 key assumptions. We need to focus on these key assumptions because this, in a sense, gets us to the essence of the problem. The strategy rested on 3 key assumptions. First, that American power, and above all, American military power, is so vast as to be irresistible. Second, the Bush administration strategy assumed that the great arc of land and people, referred to as the Greater Middle East, probably stretching from what? Morocco all the way to the southern Philippines. The Bush administration assumed that the Greater Middle East is malleable, indeed, is ripe for transformation. And third, the strategy of the freedom agenda created by the Bush administration assumed that democracy provides the necessary antidote for the pathologies afflicting the Islamic world, with the United States, of course, possessing a particular knack for exporting democracy. Now, here in 2008, given everything that has gone wrong, there are many people, I think, who would say that this freedom agenda of the Bush administration was never genuine, was always cynical and contrived. Personally, I'm not so sure. I've never met President Bush. My own sense from sort of trying to watch the man and understand the man over the course of several years is that he probably was a true believer in the freedom agenda. That on 9/11, the president was struck down as decisively as St. Paul was struck down on the road to Damascus, and he became a true believer, a born-again Wilsonian. Now, whether or not the same would be said of Donald Rumsfeld or Vice President Cheney is another matter. My guess is that they assumed that even if the freedom agenda didn't succeed in transforming the greater Middle East through the export of democracy, at the very least, the freedom agenda, again, with this understanding of the irresistibility of American power, would at least enable the United States to control the greater Middle East. In essence, for Bush administration pseudo-realists, hegemony offered a satisfactory alternative to liberation. Nonetheless, what's more important from our point of view is that events have long since demolished all three assumptions and therefore has left the freedom agenda in tatters. Let's go back down to three of them again. First, American power. Well, American power turns out to be limited, especially American military power, widely assumed to be our strong suit, has turned out to be utterly inadequate either to liberate or to pacify the greater Middle East. I mean, what are the key military lessons since 9/11? Well, one of them certainly is that shock and awe, this high-tech approach to warfare, which can do a lot of things, cannot prevent and is of little avail as a response to people's war. A second military lesson since 9/11 is that preventive war, the chief means by which the Bush administration intended to advance its freedom agenda, preventive war does not work. I mean, set aside questions of morality. Preventive war does not work. Preventive war has not been able to allow the United States to achieve the quick, decisive, and economic victories that our strategy requires. And the third lesson, I think the third military lesson since 9/11 with regard to the limitations of military power, has to do with the fact that although the force, the young men and women who serve in the Army and the Marine Corps especially, going back for their third and fourth combat tours, although the force has proven to be remarkably durable, the truth is we find ourselves with too much war for too few warriors. And given the fact that we decided some 35 or so years ago to rely on volunteers to fill that force, there's really no easy way to close the gap between too much war for too few warriors. The second assumption was about the malleability of the greater Middle East. Well, turns out to be a little tougher, perhaps, than people imagined. Remember that the Iraq War was never simply about Iraq. Operation Iraqi Freedom was intended to be the start of something much bigger. It was supposed to be a way station. Baghdad was a way station, not the final destination. Some of you may recall that former Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz once promised that Iraq would become what he called the, quote, first Arab democracy. And the key word there was first. The implication, the expectation, was that after the first would come the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth. That success in Iraq would breed success. Well, this hasn't happened. I mean, based on the progress toward the democratic transformation of Iraq and Afghanistan, only a cockeyed optimist would think that the prospects of change elsewhere in the region are promising. Iraq has become a dependency of the United States. Iraq has become a strategic cul-de-sac, a dead end. Remember that third assumption about democracy as the answer and in a U.S. ability to export democracy? Well, it turns out that the United States does not possess any particular affinity for exporting democracy. We've not been able to repeat the achievements of 1945, not surprisingly, given the fact that the conditions we're dealing with today in terms of cultures, in terms of the wars, in terms of the military situation is radically different than existed in Japan and Germany in 1945. Worse, ironically, paradoxically, where the seeds of democracy have germinated, they have not exactly produced the expected crop. There have been democratic successes, in a sense.